Walmart. Since there's a few of us here, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. If I could, sure, a few more will trickle in here in a minute. Um, let's start with the word of prayer and then we'll get into our class. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study. Just be with those who are not here for whatever reason. And just ask that you be with them and pray that they might be able to be with us at the next appointed time. Help us to clear our minds of any cares and concerns that we might have so that we can focus on what you have to teach us through your word. And Father, help us to always be doers of your word in every respect. And forgive us when we fall short. In your son's name we pray. Amen. Let's open up to Genesis chapter 12. That's where we're going to spend our time today. As we come into chapter 12, what is recorded here in chapter 12 falls into a context where, after the story of the Tower of Babel, in verses 10 through 30, after verses 1 through 9 is the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. In verses 10 through 32 of chapter 11, the author of Genesis records another long list of descendants that descended from one of the three sons of Noah, his son Shem. Now, since that's true, something we should remember about Shem is that he was considered to be a righteous individual, and so it can be assumed that many of the descendants of Shem that we find listed in that list of descendants are also righteous. But with that in mind, among the righteous individuals we find listed in verses 10 through 32 of chapter 11 is a man named Abram. It says there in chapter 11, in verse 27, now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. Now also, in verses 29 and 30 of chapter 11, we find that Abram took for himself a wife named Sarai, who was barren and had no child. Now, following those things, in verse 31 of chapter 11, we learn that Abram, along with his father, his wife, and a number of other relatives, they traveled together toward the land of Canaan, but settled in a place called Haran, however you pronounce it, until Abram's father died. Now, at that point, it is in that context that the author of Genesis begins chapter 12 by recording for his readers that after the death of Abram's father, Terah, God initiates a communication with Abram, and what God does is call Abram to break bonds with his family in order that God might take he and his wife Sarai to new lands as part of a greater call that would ultimately result in blessing for all mankind. Now, as we continue on into chapter 12, since those things are true, it's this call from God to Abram that's another very significant event in the book of Genesis, because it's another, as I've used this terminology before, another turning point in the book of Genesis that sets the stage for the rest of the events that we read about in this great book. So, with all that in mind, what we're going to do today is briefly survey chapter 12 of Genesis and consider for ourselves really 3 points about this call from God to Abram that would result in blessing not only for Abram and his wife, but also for those who would be descended from him from this point forward in Genesis. Now, the first point we'll consider based on verses 1 through 5 is that Abram was called with God's blessing. From verses 6 through 9, we'll see that Abram was called with God's promise. And finally, from verses 10 through 20, we'll see that Abram was called with God's protection. We're going to see just a series of events and this story that deals with the call of Abram. Now, after looking at these things, what we'll learn is that we are really called by God and are able to receive in a spiritual manner the same things that Abram received in these verses that we're going to be examining today. So we're going to take this in chunks. So we'll start by reading verses 1 through 5, if somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses for us. All right, we'll pause there. Thank you, Dean. So, again, the point we're going to consider for ourselves here in verses 1 through 5 is that Abram was called with God's blessing. So, beginning in verse 1, what does God want Abram, i.e., Abraham, to do? To go, to get up and go. So, what's he to do in the process? What else does the text tell us? To leave his home. Exactly. And so this is where we begin to see that Abram's really breaking bonds with some of his family. So yes, God says to go and to travel to a land that God would give him. Now, a greater picture of the nature of this call is described by Stephen in Acts 7, verses 2 through 4. We're not going to go there. But in that passage, Stephen shows that this journey that God was taking Abram on would occur in two stages. God would first bring Abram to this land called Haran, and then onto the land of Canaan after the death of Abraham's father. Questions or comments on verse 1? Okay. That is the $1,000,000 question. So, Andrea asked, she wondered why God would have him do this in the first place. We see some hint of that in the context, but as far as the specific reason God had in mind, we can't know for certain except for the blessings that would result in this call. So maybe a test of faith, possibly. So yeah. Yeah. Right. And that's something we're right. And yeah, that's true. And that's why I call it a turning point in Genesis, because this call of Abram would result in many other things that we are going to get into as we study closer Abram/Abraham. But I'm just using the name Abram here because that's what the way the text refers to him in this particular chapter. So this call has occurred. Now, what does God do next in verses 2 and 3? He makes a promise. Now, more specifically, he promises a blessing. There is a promise aspect to it, but the text uses the word bless. Now, so what's the blessing or the promise here that God makes to Abram in these two verses? Make a great nation of him, okay? Absolutely. What else does the text tell us? Make his name great. Now, we've looked at this aspect of the name. Now, when we talk about somebody's name, what are we sometimes talking about? The reputation. So, yes, there in verse 2, there's a twofold blessing that Abram would become a great nation. He'd have a long series of descendants, and then he'd have a great name, a great reputation. And verse 3 concludes, and he says, so you shall be a blessing. Abram will be somebody who's good for those that would come after him. So, as a result, God says in verse 3, he will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families will be blessed. So, what do you hear God saying to Abram there? It's going to take care of him. Absolutely. Right. Right. Yeah. Exactly. It would be relatively dangerous because, yes, Abram is traveling with a very small group of people. As far as we know, and we'll see this more in chapter 13, he's with his wife and Lot, as well as some servants that are probably with him. So, yes, he's traveling with a relatively small group of people. Anything else on verses 1 through 3 before we look at verses 4 and 5? Right? Yeah. Absolutely. So, yeah, there is evidence of faith here in Hebrews 11 that was brought up last time, points back to the faith of Abram and those with him. So, yeah, so there's the faith aspect going on. Abram is trusting in God, and we see that in the fact that he does what God tells him to do. So, with that in mind, that's what brings us into verses 4 and 5. Now, when we read through verses 4 and 5, the author of Genesis is not only recording Abram's obedience to God's call, but also records his age as well as the places that Abram traveled to and those who were traveling with him. So what we find here, in other words, are some historical and biographical details concerning Abram and the journey he was going on. Now, what's said in verse 4? Where do we see the obedience aspect? He, he departed as the Lord told him to. And that indicates that Abram did exactly as God had commanded him, no questions asked, at least not that are recorded in the text. So with that being the case, the rest of the details recorded in these verses paint the picture that Abram obeyed God's call in spite of his age, 75 years old, and in spite of the fact that he and his family would have to travel a great distance. They're on foot or on the backs of animals, but they still obey God's call with the knowledge that God would bless them in doing these things. Anything else on verses 1 through 5? Okay. So with putting all these things together, the point we should see from verses 1 through 5 is that Abram was called with God's blessing. Now, God did not call Abram just for the sake of calling him. God didn't say, you go do this because I'm God. He didn't approach it that way. God said, I have a plan to bless you, but here's what I want you to do to get that blessing. So what this tells us is that in calling Abram away from his homeland, God had something greater in store for Abram than what was in his homeland. And part of that blessing was to make Abram a great man and the father of a great nation. So that brings us into verses 6 through 9. If somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses.
Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem, that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev.
Okay, thanks, Dad. The point we're going to be looking at here is more the promise aspect of the blessing of Abram's call. So, what the author of Genesis is doing, a lot of what he's doing is recording Abram's movement. But he starts off in verse 6. Abram enters into the land of Canaan. And he gets more detailed that upon his entry, he traveled as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh, is what the New American Standard says, but adds that the Canaanite was in the land. So what the author of Genesis is doing here is giving to his readers a geographical location as well as another historical detail as to where Abram came to and the circumstances. And it says the Canaanite was in, well, first I'll deal with that in a minute. Now the place that is mentioned here is a place located in central Israel, where the oak of Moreh, I noticed that your translation said the great tree of Moreh. This is an oak tree that became famous in biblical history due to various events that occurred there in the history of God's people, including, but not limited to, the one described in the very next verse, where God appeared to Abraham, a second appearance. Now, as far as the circumstance described here, the Canaanite being in the land, the author is simply recording for his readers that when Abram came into the land of Canaan, the Canaanite people were still in the land. At this point in history, God's people have not come in and conquered this land. This is still an occupied land by those who were native to the land of Canaan. All that's happening at this point is God has brought Abraham and those with him to this land to show it to him, not for any purpose of conquering it at this point in history. Anything else on verse 6? Okay. So coming into verse 7, what does what happens in verse 7? And what did he say? To his descendants. So what's God saying? What's this looking forward to? What's that, Dean? Okay, you go here, you got that. But what does the text say? What's the promise here? His descendants would have this land. So God is repeating to Abram the promise from verses 1 through 3, but it's in a lot more simpler form. Now what does Abram do in response? Builds an altar to the Lord. Now what was the purpose of an altar? For worship. So Abram, that's another instance where Abram is worshiping God. Now God is promising that people from Abram's lineage would receive this land that Abram has come to. But something else we should understand from this verse is that the Hebrew word for descendants, in the English we have it in the plural, but in the Hebrew it's actually in the singular and could be translated as seed. Now I bring that up, it's important to remember because when we read the New Testament, God's promise to Abram here is applied to refer to the fact that the people who would receive God's promises are not who are those that were part of Abram's physical lineage, but instead of his spiritual lineage of faith. Now, this would include some of the people who were physically descended from Abraham, but it was those who had followed Abram's example of faith that were primarily the recipients of these promises. Questions or comments on verse 7? Yeah. It, yeah, that's what I'm saying, but we need to be careful what is meant by that. Yeah, in the historical context, yes. But when we look at the New Testament, and I think it's Paul in Romans, he talks about the ones who are ultimately the recipients of the promise are the ones who follow in Abram's example of faith. So yes, there is the physical aspect to this promise, but ultimately it's the spiritual aspect that becomes more important. Um, because the Jews later in biblical history got it in their minds, well, I'm a descendant of Abraham. I'm one of God's people automatically. But then Jesus comes on the scene and says, that's not what this is about. Just because, and Paul as well in Romans, they make the argument just because you're physically descended from Abraham, this doesn't mean that you're right with God. John the Baptist, I think it was John the Baptist, maybe it was Jesus, said, from these stones, God could raise children of Abraham. So again, there's the physical aspect to the promise, the descendants, but ultimately what becomes important is the spiritual aspect of the promise. Does that make sense? Okay. But yes, Elaine, going back to one part of your question, in the original Hebrew, the word descendants is in the singular, not the plural, and it's the word seed. Andrew, go ahead. Mhm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. The Canaanites in this land would have been worshiping other gods, at least as a whole. So, so yeah, there's definitely an expression of faith here in Abram's actions and movements. Anything else on verse 7? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's central Israel. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Uh, just here it is. Yeah, exactly. So that's a good point. Anything else on verse 7? Okay. So as we go into verses 8 and 9, these two verses are another record of Abram's travels. It says he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And he builds another altar. Again, we've already said that an altar is for the purpose of worship, and that's the call upon the name of the Lord language. But then after that, he journeys on and continues toward the Negev. Now, what Abraham is doing here is he's moving south from wherever he was at. And we know that because this Negev was a desert country, and it's the same place that God's people spent the 40 years prior to entering into the promised land. It's the desert country. But the point of the emphasis in these verses is that during those travels, Abram was involved in the worshiping of God. And that's why he would be building these altars, because he'd be worshiping God as a result of this promise that God made to him. This land would belong to his descendants. Um, so this is where we see the point that the call of Abraham came with a promise. So the movements here are recorded all because of that promise that God made to Abram. Abram took time to build altars to the Lord, and it's God's promise that motivated him to do the things we read about in these verses. Anything else on verses 6 through 9? Okay. So this brings us into verses 10 through 20. Now, Abram's moving south. He's in the land of Canaan. But what does verse 10 tell us? What's the circumstance in the land of Canaan at that time? There's a famine in the land. So what does Abram do? Where does he go? He goes to Egypt. And it says because the famine was severe in the land. So this is an introductory statement. He's continuing to record Abram's movement. He's in Canaan, there's a famine, so he goes to Egypt. Now, we can't be certain as to why Abram chose to migrate to Egypt, but one possible reason that has been suggested is because of the fact that at this time, the Nile River was in Egypt and still there today, but it was a very good water source for the growth of crops in that land. In the land of Canaan, however, that area was entirely dependent on rainfall. So there wasn't a lot of rainfall that year. I think we're familiar with that. Droughts. And it caused famine in the land of Canaan. So Abram travels to Egypt because he knows that's a well-watered area with the Nile River. Elaine, go ahead. Mm-hmm. That's true. So they were very smart people, so to speak. Anything else on verse 10? Right. Where it came from, right? Yes, he was. He was still trying to obey God, not going back to his homeland. So good point. Anything else on verse 10? Okay. So this brings us into verses 11 and 12, where there's an event that occurs. Now I'll just read those again. It says, verse 11, 12, it came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, see now I know that you're a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Now, what's Abram worried about there in verses 11 and 12? His own life. Why? What does he think is going to happen? They're going to try to steal his wife and kill him. Now, why would that be true? I mean, what is Abraham right to be afraid, in other words? Exactly. So he's exposed. So he's right to be afraid, Andrea. Exactly. All right. Go ahead. Okay. All right. Right.
I don't think we understand this very well.
Okay.
Because in chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, the Lord said to Abraham, or Abram,
Mm-hmm.
he didn't pick up his Bible and get the word saying, go. God talked to him affirmatively.
It was direct communication. Yeah.
So I think he was very weak in his faith in this moment.
Probably. There
Because
is.
he apparently had the, we have prayers and we are sometimes unsure how God answers our prayers.
That's true.
And I don't know how God answered Abram's prayers, but apparently there was direct communication
Yeah.
where he somehow heard the voice of God or God communicated directly with him. Yeah. And he messed up. Yeah. And like I say, don't want to be judgmental because I would make those same mistakes.
They were. It can happen. All right.
I'm very
Exactly.
glad that God did not start with Jim because I would hate to have my life under a magnifying glass like we do Adam and like we do Noah and like we do Abraham.
Yeah.
I
Good.
connected and David and the others on truth,
All right.
but I just see that his faith wasn't wavering at this moment, which is all of us in following their example. Our faith is strong at some times, and our faith is weak at other times. And I think we can gain some confidence in this that the father of the faithful, Abraham, wavered at times.
It did. So he's yeah.
And David, who was named a man after God's own heart by God himself,
Yeah.
as he had his warts.
All right. So with all that in mind, coming back to the text, Abram's afraid about what might happen to him if these Egyptians found out his wife. And one reason, at least a possible reason, that Abram has this fear is because the Egyptians, they worship other gods, and they'd have no problem killing Abram in order to take Sarai for themselves. So what's his solution to the problem? There in verse 13. Say, you are my sister. It was a half-truth. And the reason we know that is because in Genesis 20, verse 12, we learned that Abram and Sarai had the same father, but not the same mother. So yes, it's a half-truth. So having recorded those things in verses 14 and 15, they saw that Sarai was a beautiful woman. What do? Okay, I told Pharaoh, and then what's the result? What does Pharaoh do? Brings it to his house, I might say a palace. Now, this isn't a foreign practice. What the author records here refers to an ancient practice where beautiful women from foreign countries would often be taken in by those who were in positions of rulership. Now, that was most common in situations of warfare, but not always in situations of warfare. It would also be in situations where foreigners migrated into lands like Abram and Sarai are doing. Now, with that in mind, how does Pharaoh treat her in verse 16? Or how does he treat Abram? I'm sorry. Treated him well and gave him many things. So, Sarai is taken from Abram, but Abram's still treated well and is given these gifts. Now, why would he be given gifts? It's something along those lines. He's compensating Abram for giving up his wife, or in this case, as far as Pharaoh is concerned, his sister. And so Abram receives these gifts, and receiving these gifts, he'd become a very wealthy individual. So building on that, in verse 17, the author of Genesis goes on, what does God do? Of serious diseases. Where else does that happen? What book of the Bible? Exodus. So something very similar has happened. And we know this is similar because the word for plagues used here, it's the same word that describes the 10 plagues that we read about in Exodus. So this is different sicknesses and diseases. They're not specifically named. So what does Pharaoh do in response in verses 18 and 19? Go ahead, Andrew. Yeah. Yes, he does. He notices the women. Um, that's okay. So what does Pharaoh do after these plagues come? Exactly. So he asks these questions. He goes on to say, just why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Is one of the questions he asks her. Why have you done this to me? So what we also learn from these questions is that one reason Pharaoh had taken Sarai from Abram is because he was taking her as his wife. He doesn't know this is Abram's wife until this point. That is the $1,000,000 question, as we might say. We don't know. We don't know how Pharaoh discovered that Sarai was Abram's wife, but we can assume that the plagues that were brought on Pharaoh and his household had something to do with his discovery of these things. But the text doesn't tell us for certain. We're going into verse 20, but he doesn't kill Abram. What does he do? Sends him. He sends him away. And they escort him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. Abram leaves with all his possessions. And the story of Abram's call comes to a close. And from what we read in chapter 13, we can know that after this point, Abram leaves Egypt and he returns back in the direction that he'd come. So Abram was protected. God takes care of him in all of this, as was said earlier, and along with his family. So Abram was a man specifically called by God with his blessing, his promise, and his protection. The application of that to us is that we too are called by God. And today he calls us through the gospel. And when we respond in obedience to that, we get God's blessing, his promises, and his protection in a spiritual manner. And when we do respond to the gospel call, we're following in Abram's example of faith and with all the blessings that come with that. Any other questions on anything we've looked at today? All right. Matt, will you close us today?